All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. We are joined by a new guest, somebody whose work I have been familiar with, but this is the first time we've had the opportunity to sit down and have a conversation. Dr. Jonathan Fuqua is joining us, and we're going to talk about classical theism and the problem of evil, so some big topics. Dr. Fuqua is the editor of this new volume, which I have mentioned. Sorry, I have this virtual background, so it makes seeing things really annoying. You guys know the book, Classical Theism, New Essays on the Metaphysics of God. You edited this along with another friend of the show, Dr. Rob Coons. It's an excellent volume, and we just confirmed that it's actually still, this is crazy to me because it's such a new book and it's such an awesome book, that it's still free. It's free as a digital download on Amazon. So if people haven't taken advantage of that, I don't know what else to say. I mean, I couldn't imagine a reason why somebody wouldn't go and download it for free if you're interested in these sorts of topics. But Dr. Fuqua, thank you for taking time to be here. Great to have you on the show.
Hey, Pat, thanks for having me. I'm a longtime listener and a fan of your show, so it's an honor to finally be on with you.
Yeah, well, it's a real pleasure. And before we get into the topics today, since this is the first time you've been on the show, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Dr. Fuqua? How did you come to be doing all the stuff you're doing and philosophy of religion and all that sort of
Yeah,
business?
yeah, thanks. So I'm a professor of philosophy at Conception Seminary College, which is an undergraduate seminary located in Northeast Missouri or Northwest Missouri at Conception Abbey. So it's a Benedictine undergrad seminary. So all the students there are philosophy majors because they're all studying for the Catholic priesthood. This is my fourth year here. It's a great place to be. I teach natural theology every year and metaphysics every year, and so we're neck deep in classical theistic metaphysics and philosophy of religion on a regular basis there at Conception. To make a long story short, I went to college as an undergraduate. Had some wonderful professors, really great people who were formative for me. But many of them, in some directly, some indirectly, but they challenged the religious beliefs I had grown up with. I'm Catholic now, but I grew up as a Protestant, very devout Protestant. These were mainline Protestants, so very theologically liberal, as we might put it, and then also professors who were just atheists and agnostics.
Mm-hmm.
And they raised a lot of. I was a physical education major, PE major. I was going to be a football coach. That was my plan at the time.
Awesome.
So we're a long way from that. I was a very serious Christian, but I didn't know how to answer their objections at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so a friend of mine from high school recommended that I read Lee Strobel's books, The Case for Christ and The Case for Faith. I don't know if you're familiar with those, Pat.
Yeah, my wife actually read one of those years ago. I won't get into my story now, but we kind of had different paths to Christianity, and I forget which one it was, but I remember she read one of those, and it really kind of pulled her in, intrigued her. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up specifically Pentecostal, so very kind of an anti-intellectual wing of the Christian tradition. I didn't even know there were Christian scholars at all. I didn't know that was even a thing.
Yeah,
and then Lee Strobel is this atheist journalist who becomes a Christian, and he interviews all these Christian scholars, and they started to help me see that there were some plausible answers to these really tough objections, and that began a path of I began to see that most of the objections to the Christian faith are really, at the end of the day, even the ones that are made by historical critical biblical scholarship, are really based in philosophical assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you wanted to get to the root of the objections to the Christian faith in the modern world, you had to study philosophy. And that got me going. And so I kind of through apologetics. It was my route into philosophy, and I switched to history and political science, and started studying some political theory along the way, and that was another route into philosophy. And so what got me specifically interested in classical theism is that it's part of my conversion story into Catholicism more generally.
Mm-hmm.
I had an intellectual conversion in the sense that I sort of read my way into the church. And I realized as I was reading my way into the church, and then after I came into the church, that the view of God I had was basically what Brian Davis and what others call theistic personalism. I basically thought of God as sort of like an invisible Superman. And I read people in the tradition saying things about God that I had never heard before, but that were intriguing, like, oh, God is a being greater than which none can be imagined, or God is pure subsistent being itself, or in God is pure act. I'm like, what does that even mean? Or God's impassible. That just seems crazy to me. What does this even mean? And then I went on for PhD studies and came into the church and got this job, and I'm continuing to explore and try to get a deeper understanding of the divine nature. And so I'm looking around for resources, and there are great resources on this or that aspect of the divine natures. Great monographs on divine timelessness or divine impassibility or whatever. But I couldn't find a single resource that sort of, in one book, sort of summed up the classical theistic view of God and gave arguments for it, and that were cutting edge and up to date and very deep and all that. The closest thing I could find, it wasn't from a strictly classical theist perspective, was a little book by Tom Morris called Our Idea of God. Have you ever seen that book, Pat?
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, there's a lacuna, there's a gap in the literature. Anytime a young scholar sees a gap in the literature, he's thinking that there's a bullet point on my CV. If I can if I can fill that lacuna. And so, my own specialty in research was actually not in it was in problem of evil stuff is one thing that I can sort of specialize in, but I'd written my dissertation on moral skepticism, and I had published some papers on that. And so I thought, well, for me to write a book on classical theism would probably take a few years of research and a lot of work, and it seemed easier to edit.
Have everybody else write it for you.
Exactly. Find the specialists. I'm reading them anyway to try to figure out what I should think about God.
Yeah.
And so I asked Rob Coons, my co-editor, of course. Yeah, Rob, and I think he's one of the world's finest living metaphysicians. He's an excellent philosopher of religion.
Agreed.
And I thought, okay, if I can get Rob to do this with me, we can put something together that'll be really high quality with top-notch scholars, and that's what we were able to do.
Yeah. So. You really did. You nailed it. And I mean, you got great. If people aren't familiar, again, it's free on Kindle. How many times do I have to mention this? These people should have already read the full thing. You've got Proust in here. You've got Coons himself, obviously. Klima, I'm a big fan of his work. DeHaan, Timothy O'Connor. Just I'm trying to now find everyone who's been on the show before. About half of the people have been guests on the show, which is shows which direction we lean on here, right? Christopher Tomaszewski, Tyler McNabb, yeah. So Mark Spencer, yeah, just Father Rooney, yeah. Really great volume. Lots of deep subjects treated in a very sophisticated way. So congratulations, it's a great volume. I think it is a genuine contribution. I've been getting a ton out of it myself. So what we wanted to do here was just kind of maybe introduce classical theism. We can kind of start in the shallow end, sometimes we like to say, and if we end up going into the deep end, great. But then at some point I wanted to pivot to some of the work that you've been doing on the problem of evil. You sent me that article a couple of weeks ago that I found really fascinating, and seems like we think about this along some of the same lines of offering a sort of holistic approach to the problem of evil, and we think that classical theism might have some something to offer here, some unique resources. So how's that sound to you, Dr. Fuqua?
Yeah, sounds perfect.
All right, where do you want to start? How do you like to introduce people to the idea of, it's funny, I know you have children, right? I think we're
5.
Yep. Hey, we have 5 too, right?
Hey, awesome.
Do you find that you just have to just like wring the theistic personalism out of your kids, right? Last night I was putting my or 2 nights ago, one of these, I was putting my daughter Maren to bed. And she asked all the kids ask great theological questions, right? About God and all this other stuff. And so I was kind of, given a little bit of a spiel as best as I could. And then she's like, oh, God's kind of like a superhero. I'm like, wait, where's Brian Davis when you need him? And I'm like, no, God doesn't have to get his powers or anything like that. God just is his power. And then my daughter, who loves video games and Kirby, made the connection. So he's not like Kirby, Kirby, the big puffball who sucks things up and absorbs. She's like, he's not like Kirby, right? He doesn't have to get his power. He just is his power. So you make what sort of connections you can,
right,
for the children. But I guess when she said like a superhero, we could have been generous and say, okay, maybe she's got the principle of analogy in hand or something like
there you
that.
go.
Right? Maybe she's not a hardcore theistic personalist or something like that. So anyways, just wanted to interject with that little anecdote, but take it away.
Yeah, I think the theistic personalist view of God is it's sort of where we have to start as children. I think pedagogically, maybe thinking of when you're a small child, right? Especially if you're kind of rooted in Scripture, which is Scripture is I think it presents a classical theistic picture of God, but it's not a systematic philosophy book, and so it doesn't get into metaphysical details. That's not the point of divine revelation. But you should be childlike, but not childish. And as your mind grows and as you start to become more educated and to learn things like metaphysics, you begin to see hopefully a richer, deeper, more beautiful picture of God really emerge from Scripture and from good metaphysics than sort of the childish idea of God that you sort of start out with. So I think the reason I picked this essay to talk about, Pat, so it's Edward Feser wrote this first chapter for us called "What is Classical Theism?" Because this is getting a lot of discussion right now in the philosophical literature,
right?
What classical theism is and various things it says about God and versus theistic personalism, and I think Feser does a good job helping us understand not only what classical theism is, but also why classical theists say the things about God that they do.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna read his definition of classical theism.
Great.
So he says, classical theism, here I'm quoting him, is the thesis that God is to be conceived of first and foremost as the ultimate reality in the order of being, and the ultimate explanation of things in the order of discovery. That when followed out consistently, this entails that the divine attributes must include simplicity, immutability, impassibility, atemporality, complete knowledge of the future, and causal involvement in everything that exists or occurs, and that as corollaries, we ought to affirm the doctrines of divine conservation and concurrence. And so in the literature, there's a lot of talk about, say simplicity or impassibility or immutability or atemporality or whatever, or with open theism, does God know the future and things like that. But there hasn't been I think one of the nice things that Feser does is he tells us sort of why classical theists think about God in the specific way that they do. Why do we affirm these attributes? It's not just that in any particular case, there's a good argument for that particular attribute. It's that there's something deeper going on here. And that's this conceiving of God first and foremost as the ultimate reality in the order of being and the ultimate explanation of things in the order of discovery. And so Feser, he tells us that this idea of God's ultimacy has a kind of what he calls regulative status, that it puts constraints on everything else that we say about God. So here I'll quote him again. He says, quote, "The notion of God's ultimacy has a regulative status in classical theism that it does not have in non-classical forms of theism. It puts strict constraints on what else we can say about God and how we ought to interpret the other things that we say about him." I'll give examples of this in a minute. Feser notes there's sort of two versions of classical theism. There's the sort of what he calls perfect being theology, and then there's what he calls, which is a well-known phrase, and there's what he calls first cause theology. So perfect being theology, that version of classical theism is most associated with Saint Anselm, and sort of starts with the idea of God as the greatest possible being or a maximally great being, and it sort of infers in top-down fashion what a maximally great being would be like. And then the first cause theology starts with the idea of God as the ultimate cause in the world and goes on in a sort of bottom-up fashion to say what else must be true of God given that the world is his effect. And these are complementary, I think, approaches that a theoretician can use both of these. There's no incompatibility here. So with respect to the regulative status of God's ultimacy, just to give one example, just to start with simplicity for a minute and talk about a couple of other divine attributes. So why do such an odd thing to say about God, right? Like you're trying to tell your daughter, well, God just is his powers. He doesn't just have them.
He's not Kirby.
He's not Kirby. Exactly. And of course, this is so hard for us because God is radically transcendent compared to us. And so, of course, it's difficult for us to understand the nature of God. And so it's much easier to think of God as having a bunch of properties in the way that human beings have a bunch of properties.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a good reason, a good metaphysical reason for saying that God doesn't have a bunch of properties, but just is his powers. That God is his intellect, and he is his will, and his intellect and will are not two separate parts of God.
Mm-hmm.
Which is that if God were composite, then he would be a contingent being. He would be contingent on two things at least. Internally, he would be contingent upon his parts.
Yep.
And then externally, he would be dependent on a unifying composer to put those parts together.
Mm-hmm.
But if God's a contingent being, then he's not ultimate in the order of being, and he can't be nor can he be ultimate in the order of explanation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If God's contingent, if he's composite, he's contingent. He receives existence, and so he's just one more thing that needs to be explained like everything else.
Right? Yeah. Or he's just a brute fact.
And a brute fact.
And at that point, this is why you get the sort of polemical remarks, but they're pointing at this deeper consideration that to just take this non-classical theist position is just to concede atheism. And what is that? What is that? Exactly. What is that getting at? It's getting at that if you think that reality is ultimately intelligible, fully and completely intelligible,
right?
There's something we have to be able to trace back to or twist up to that sort of escapes all those categories that are contingency implying, right?
Yep.
And
precisely.
that's sort of what we think an absolutely simple being would be capable of doing, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly. So, precisely. And
Mm-hmm.
we give this kind of argument for all the sort of weird things that classical theists like to say about God. God's immutable. Why? Well, because changing beings are compositions of act and potency. There's contingency, as you said, Pat. And so whatever explains the order of changing beings must itself not be one more changing being, but rather must be just something that's pure actuality.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing for the other sorts of compositions: essence and existence, matter and form, substance and accidents. So once you begin to understand why classical theists say these things about God, all of a sudden, that traditional roster of divine attributes that we assign to God as classical theists, it starts to make a whole lot more sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of discussion about those attributes in the Phaser paper and how they're sort of they flow ultimately from this rationale of God's ultimacy as possessing this regulative status.
Mm-hmm.
But then he does something else kind of at the end, Pat, which is helpful. He contrasts classical theism with some of its competitor views of the divine nature, and sort of says kind of helps you to see and understand if God's ultimacy has regulative status according to classical theists, what has regulative status according to other views of the divine nature? So he discusses deism, process theism, open theism, and theistic personalism. So maybe we could just briefly kind of contrast.
Mm-hmm.
So deism is the view that once God creates the world, it can exist without him.
Yeah.
So it denies the doctrines of divine conservation.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that every contingent thing not only requires an originating cause, but also that every contingent thing needs a sustaining cause at every moment that it exists.
Mm-hmm.
And Phaser says deism is motivated principally by considerations about the ontological independence of the created order. It's not motivated by a concern for God's ultimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Process theism. This is the view that God is changing and passable, that he's sort of changing along with the world. He's growing along with the world. Process theists also deny divine conservation and divine concurrence. And what sort of has regulative status for them is the project of preserving human free will, and a sort of general process metaphysics.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not divine ultimacy.
That's right.
Now there's not, there's not a ton of deists and process theists out there.
I met a deist on YouTube the other day.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
There's a few here and there.
One.
Yeah. More. Haven't encountered a polytheist in a long time, though. However, right? Yeah.
more common are open theists and theistic personalists, especially
Right.
theistic personalists. So open theism, this is a view that God doesn't know the future because it can't be known, and it says that God can learn, and therefore that God is changeable, and therefore that God has potentiality as well as actuality. So it's incompatible with divine simplicity. It's incompatible with pure atheism, and so forth. And their concern is mainly human free will, also project of preserving human free will.
Yeah.
And then finally, what kind of the main rival, I guess you could say, is theistic personalism. And again, I like the way that Fazer explains this. And I'll quote him here, Pat. He says the basic thesis of theistic personalism is that whatever else God is, he is an instance of the genus person, alongside other instances such as human persons, angelic persons, and any other species of persons that there might be. Their fundamental motivation is the conviction that whatever else we say about God, we must first and foremost take him to be a person of a certain kind, albeit a person who does not have the limitations that human persons have.
Yeah.
So that's what has regulative status for the theistic personalist, is the idea that God is a person.
Right. And we think of, I was just revisiting one of Swinburne's books the other day, and I don't know if his views how much they've morphed over the recent years, or not, but at least when I return to his, existence of God and stuff, I think he's a pretty representative example of this position. Right.
Right. Exactly. And of course that the theistic personalist view, as Fazer conceives it, would imply composition in God, right? Because God is there must be some specific difference, right, to get a divine being. So you've got God as sort of this combination of the genus person and a specific difference of divinity, and then so that undermines God's simplicity, and thus undermines his necessity, and so is incompatible with the ultimacy that God possesses. So I think if any potential readers started looking to understand what exactly classical theism is and why classical theists say these seemingly bizarre things about God, what's driving that, I think this first chapter by Fazer is will be very helpful.
It is excellent. I want to just say a few, that was great. It's a wonderful sort of taxonomy of positions. And I like that you sort of spelled out some of the motivations, and again, just kind of putting my cards and history on the table. One of the reasons I was very attracted to classical theism is because I was sort of just interested in the question of ultimate explanation. And classical theism, as you know, Professor, and many listeners here, it's not restricted to Christianity or Catholicism by any means. You find it across a range of different traditions, among different thinkers who keep kind of converging upon the same thing, right? And it's the idea that if we're going to get an ultimate explanation, it's going to have to be sort of wholly other, right? It's going to have to be it's going to have to escape these categories that, again, are contingency or dependency implying. And then there's all your spooky stuff, right?
Right.
But I think it's appropriate. I like the spooky stuff. I really do, because I think there's other deep issues that if the spooky stuff weren't true, I don't see what the solutions are. If you kind of get what I'm winking at, including like issues of divine epistemology and skepticism and stuff like that, right? Like there better be something spooky going on, or otherwise I think we're going to be in some really weird scenarios, right?
Well, if you take on board sort of classical metaphysics of ancient and medieval philosophy, it's very difficult to get around this picture of God.
Yeah.
Because it's straightforwardly implied by the fundamental principles of the metaphysics embraced by the collective, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, and others in that sort of tradition. And so if you're gonna say something else about the divine nature, it's really going to force you to embrace a different sort of metaphysical system altogether.
Yeah,
I think, and insofar as this is a pretty darn good metaphysical system, this sort of classical metaphysics, then we have pretty darn good reason to embrace the picture of God. It's telling us about, and Fazer also is at pains to emphasize that the classical theist picture of God, in his view, and in view of the likes of Augustine and Aquinas and Anselm and Bonaventure and so forth, is fully consistent with the picture of God in Scripture. And he points out that everybody has to bring philosophical categories and tools to the project of interpreting Scripture.
Right on.
No one, not even the theistic personalist, thinks that when the Bible talks about God breathing into Adam the breath of life, that God has a set of lungs,
or walking, right? Yeah.
or that God has a pair of legs or a set of hands. And so, the question becomes, well, which philosophical tools then should you use to help you properly exegete the Scriptures? Well, the correct ones, which would be, again, classical metaphysics.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why I think you see in modern and contemporary philosophy, Pat, the move away from medieval Christendom it's the great philosophers of modernity understood that to reject this worldview, to reject God's existence or the picture of God received from the classical theist tradition, you do have to go below the surface and reject the underlying metaphysics. And this is why you find these brilliant but misguided men coming up with radically different metaphysical systems. They see the connection. I'm afraid, Pat, that a lot of contemporary philosophers of religion who are on the theistic personalist side, it's kind of my estimation that they don't quite see the connection between this classical metaphysics, which I think is the best metaphysics we've got, and the classical theistic picture of God. They seem to think that we can alter the picture of God away from classical theism without doing serious damage to our underlying metaphysics. And I just don't think you can do that.
No, I think that's absolutely correct, right? I think it's a package deal for sure. And, just to highlight some of the other motivations or concerns, maybe somebody is going for, and starting point matters, right? Like where somebody starts. If you just start kind of as a Christian with a set of concerns versus if you just start from like crawling out of like a pit of atheistic nihilism, you might have different concerns motivating your project, right? I didn't start as a Christian of a certain sort, right? I started as somebody who was just kind of on a philosophical hunt for intelligibility. But somebody might be starting as a Christian, right? And they might hear this picture of classical theism, and they might be concerned that they think that this makes God that God isn't relatable, right? That God isn't I can relate. This isn't a personal God. And I think that's wrong, but I think that I think it's fair to say this is one of the concerns that might be motivating that. In fact, I know it because they're explicit about these concerns many times, right? Human freedom, another concern, right? If God if universal causality is true, if God is absolutely the fundamental first cause of everything that exists apart from himself, where is the room for human freedom, libertarian free will, all these sorts of things? And I want to say up front, like, yeah, those are good questions, and they're not easy questions to answer. I'll just kind of confidently assert I think there are good answers to them from the classical theistic picture, and you do not have to. And I think the best answers are within the classical theistic picture and found within the sort of transcendent causality that comes along with that picture of God to help answer some of these difficult concerns. But I want to say I appreciate the concerns, and I can see why people would have those concerns from certain perspectives. Right. Yeah. I don't know if there's anything else I want to say about that. If anything else you want to add there, or should we turn to the problem of evil now?
I'll just say one quick thing. First, sure. I think you're right, and I think, of course, as classical theists, we don't deny that God is personal. God has intellect and will, and that's what it takes to be a personal being. We do deny that God is a person, like you or me. We do deny that God is is an instance of the genus person. And as Fazer points out, especially for Christians, we can't say just simply that God is a person. that would be heretical.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation about the different starting points. I guess one good place that listeners could go if they want to explore the concerns that you mentioned on behalf of the theistic personalist and to investigate more deeply the God of classical theism, the God of the Bible. Eleanor Stump has this little book published by Marquette University Press. You've probably seen it, Pat.
Oh yeah, God of Philosopher and God of the Bible. Wonderful little volume.
Yeah, wonderful little volume. So for listeners for listeners for whom the concerns that you just mentioned, Pat, are really driving the project of thinking about God, I recommend that little book by Eleanor Sump.
It is great. It is good, especially if you don't want to go into actually speaking of Professor Stump, wonderful thinker. Her book, you can see my kids got a hold of this one.
That's awesome.
Aquinas. She does a nice job of summarizing some of the key concerns of God's eternity, God's immutability in relation to a contingent world and stuff like that. So I'm glad you brought that one up. I often forget about that one. There's those little Marquette ones are really good. Maritan's is really good too, I thought. There's even we brought up Swinburne. He's got a little good one on simplicity that I thought was really well done.
Yeah.
Those are a great resource. All right, so let's turn now to the problem of evil. And it was interesting to kind of read some of your history. You went to Purdue, and you had Professor Paul Draper at some point. And what a great guy to study under when it comes to this, because he's sort of known as the guy on the problem of evil, and rightfully so. He's got a lot of important and challenging things to say on that front. So give us a little personal history there, if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Fuqua, of kind of what led to the development of your thought on this particular issue, if you don't mind.
So I did my PhD at Purdue, as you mentioned. First semester there was a fall semester of 2012, and I take a class there with Dr. Draper, who's a great guy. He was on my dissertation committee. Really excellent philosopher, very kind man. He's an Eatser, or at least the last time I spoke to him, he was an Eatser. Eatsism. Are you familiar with this, Pat? It comes from a Dutch word that means something. So Paul, Dr. Draper, he believes in somethingism is how he used to explain it to me. But at that point, he wasn't sure what else to say about it. So
interesting.
He said it was the dominant religious view among the Dutch a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So as you mentioned, he's I think, in my views, the world's leading proponent of the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm.
He's got the most sophisticated, plausible version of the problem of evil. And I took this class because I think the problem of evil, in my opinion, Pat, it's the only really decent objection to God's existence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the most serious objection, I think. And it's an objection that is ubiquitous. Almost everyone who doesn't believe in God, atheist or agnostic or eats or whatever, they do so in part because of the problem of evil.
Sure, right.
And so I think if theists can respond to this problem, I think we've responded to really the strongest objection, the only decent objection there is to God. So I took this class with Dr. Draper. It was an excellent class. We read all kinds of people, and got sort of a cutting edge overview of the state of the literature as of 2012.
Yeah.
One thing, though, looking back, that we didn't cover is we did read a paper by Stump, but other than that, sort of the classical theist way of looking at the problem of evil was sort of strangely absent from our consideration. Instead, what we ended up focusing on are what I call these 4 standard responses, which is the theodicy response, the natural theology response, the skeptical theism response, and the reformed epistemology response. So let me just quickly explain what each of those are. So the theodicy response says
this is great, by the way. We're getting like a taxonomy of a lot of different things. So I really appreciate this. This will be like a great sort of introductory episode for a lot of people. Just want to say I appreciate it. Yep.
You're welcome. So the theodicy response says we can tell stories that are true, or at least true for all we know, about why God allows evil in the world. And how does that help with the problem of evil? Well, maybe initially we don't know why God allows some evil, and maybe that does lower our credence in God's existence or give us evidence against God's existence. But then we get an explanation for why God allows the evil, and the explanation sort of defeats the defeating evidence provided by the data of evil that we encountered. So, so like if I see you out to having lunch with a woman who's not your wife, then I get some evidence, right, that maybe you're not being faithful. And so let's say I ask you about it and you're like, oh, that's my sister. You see the resemblance? She's my twin, just without the beard. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense, right? So the explanation defeats the defeating evidence I was initially given. The natural theology response says that any negative evidence against theism that's provided by the data of evil is outweighed by the positive evidence for theism. so that the total, what's sometimes called the total propositional evidence, supports God's existence. Skeptical theism response says that we are not in a position to say how likely the facts of evil are given theism. So we cannot assign a low probability to some evil given theism. We just can't say, we're in the dark. We have these suffer from these cognitive limitations. And so we can't say that some evil is less likely on theism than it is on naturalism, because we don't know how likely it is on theism.
Yeah.
And then finally, we have the Reformed epistemology response. And this response says that theists enjoy, or at least can enjoy, non-inferential justification for belief in God, such that belief in God can be justified even if it doesn't gain any positive justificatory status from its ability to explain some body of data. So there, even if the inferential evidence tells against theism, the total evidence might tell in favor of theism insofar as we have strong non-natural reasons to think that God exists.
Yeah, right. And that last one is going to link up with Plantinga's Reformed epistemology and externalists. So for people who are unfamiliar, if you follow Plantinga and his, I guess, externalist theory of knowledge and proper functionalism, and if God exists, you're going to be justified in believing in God, and it provides sort of a shield, right? Maybe a way to think about it, that might not be totally impenetrable, but is pretty strong, right? That even if you don't have any good arguments on the ready for God, or even defeaters for the challenge or the problem of evil, you could still be justified in your belief in God from that perspective, right?
Exactly. And a good example Plantinga gives in his proper functionalist epistemology work to illustrate that, Pat, would be, I think this is one of Plantinga's examples. So suppose that you've been accused of some crime that you didn't actually commit, and you didn't commit it because you remember not committing the crime. But maybe someone framed you, and there's a lot of evidence that you in fact are guilty. So what? Maybe the evidence is so strong that you think, wow, if I were in the jury, I would vote that I'm guilty. But of course, that you're not guilty.
Right.
So what's going on in that situation? Well, you've got a lot of inferential reasons to think that you're guilty, but those are swamped epistemically by your non-inferential reasons for thinking that you're not guilty, which is that you remember that you didn't commit the crime.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good example.
So in the problem of evil literature, people are they're picking one of these four responses and they're developing it in some detail. And that I call that the piecemeal approach. And that does have some advantages because it allows you to see what merits or demerits can be found in any one single approach.
Sure.
But it has the demerit of kind of blocking us unintentionally, so to speak, from thinking about maybe the possibility of a more holistic response, that one that would combine these four together. And another thing that does impede that holistic response is that sometimes it's argued that you can't actually combine skeptical theism with natural theology, or you can't combine skeptical theism with theodicy. People have argued that in print.
Yeah.
And so the thought is that you have to sort of the incentives which guide publishing mandate. Okay, pick one of these and write a paper or a book on it. Don't write a paper or a book on all four of these.
Right.
And then, by the way, they're not compatible anyway, so don't even think about combining them.
Yeah, but if you actually read this stuff, you quickly come to question that. Like take von Inwagen, right? I did an episode not too long ago. It's like some people classify him as a skeptical theist, but like at the same time, he seems to give a theodicy, right?
Yes.
So he's kind of. It seems like to me he's at least kind of doing both of those two things.
Right.
If you've read him.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so by the end of this course, I actually wrote a paper, Pat, as a distant ancestor to this one.
Oh yeah,
forthcoming in a book. And I wrote a paper called the Skeptical Theodicist. Was the term paper. Draper loved the idea of it. Said, you should write your dissertation on this. So I ended up writing my dissertation on moral skepticism instead. But I never got away from this idea that it was a false dichotomy, sort of forcing me to pick one or two of these four responses when it seemed to me you could actually combine them.
Right.
So then, as I'm doing this deep dive on the nature of God and coming to have this sort of more metaphysically robust, classically grounded picture of God, as we talked about earlier, I'm thinking that classical theism seems to provide, first of all, it seems to support all four of these responses.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to provide grounds for an additional fifth response, such that the classical theist sort of worldview, if you will, of the classical theist picture of God and man, and man's and the way that human language and thought applies to God analogically and so forth, seems to actually provide a very good sort of framework within which to give an even more holistic response, of what I call a fivefold holistic response. And so maybe, Pat, I'll quickly just sort of mention how classical theism supports each of these four.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And then tack on the fifth response that's sort of unique to classical theism.
Perfect.
So anyone who's familiar with the history of philosophy knows that classical theists typically think that you can use metaphysics to demonstrate that God exists, as we and there's a great chapter in the Classical Theism book by Rob Kuhns. It's the second chapter, Does the God of Classical Theism Exist?, where he summarizes some of these arguments.
Mm-hmm.
And so Aquinas grounds this project on at least three different but linked ideas. For one thing, God as pure act is most knowable, because for Aquinas, the knowability of a thing is determined by its form, or by the thing by which it is an act. Mm-hmm. And so God is pure act, and so God in himself is most knowable. Then we have something you mentioned, Pat, the intelligibility of all being, which is a typically medieval way of expressing the principle of sufficient reason.
Right.
And then we have Aquinas and other classical theists affirming man's ability to engage in causal reasoning. From a contingent effect, you can always reason back to the cause. And so with these three general metaphysical ideas, it opens up the door to make arguments for God's existence. So from beings that change, and the idea of change is the actualization of potentiality, you can reason to a being that's pure act. From composite beings, you can reason to a being that's pure simplicity. Mm-hmm. From beings in whom there's a distinction between essence and existence, you can reason to a being in whom there is no distinction between essence and existence. And so this natural theology stuff is very relevant to the problem of evil. And in a famous 1979 paper, William Rowe, otherwise, so Pat, you know who William Rowe is, I'm sure.
Of course. Mm-hmm.
He preceded Dr. Draper at Purdue.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that during the time that William Rowe was sort of at the top of his game, he was the foremost proponent of the problem of evil in the world.
Right.
And then Dr. Rowe retires and is replaced by Dr. Paul
passes
Draper,
on the torch. Right.
Passes on the torch, exactly. Mm-hmm. So at Purdue, Purdue's a great place to do philosophy of religion, by the way, for any budding philosophers out there. But anyway, in this 1979 paper, Rowe argues that, Rowe basically argues, if God exists, pointless evil does not exist, but pointless evil does exist, so therefore God does not exist. But Rowe acknowledges at the end of the paper that the theist could pull what he calls a G.E. Moore shift, and simply say, well, if God exists, pointless evil does not exist. That's true, but God does exist.
So there's no gratuitous evil, right? Yeah,
exactly. So there's no pointless evil. So I think whether the natural theology stuff is used in that way, or whether it's used in a more sort of Swinburnian way, where, look, yes, we've got some inferential reasons against God in the form of the problem of evil, but our total inferential evidence makes God's existence more probable than not. However you want to do it, the point is, natural theology affords a good response, at least in part, to the problem of evil.
Yeah, I want to highlight that, because that's really important. A lot of times when we're doing the engaging with the problem of evil, it's sort of done in the contemporary worldview comparison mode, right? The Swinburnian way.
Yeah.
And that's just that's just not how somebody like Aquinas would have thought of it, right? Aquinas would have been like, wait, hold on. What didn't you understand about demonstration, son? Right?
Right. We've got indemonstrable first principles,
right.
And by deductive principles, they imply that God is pure act.
And sure, maybe people reject that, but methodologically, it's important to get this point that if you think that approach is available and it's a good one, then anything but classical theism at that point, arguably, certainly naturalism, right? That's a probability zero, which is sticky.
Right.
Like you can't lift it anymore.
Right.
So
exactly.
evidential considerations thereafter are really just irrelevant. And then you can just be like, look, if two things are actual, they must be compatible, right? And metaphysics of privation aside, let's just say evil, suffering's actual, God's actual, they must be compatible.
Right.
Done. Right.
Right.
That's kind of like the hard and fast old school approach, right? And then it's you might want to say, okay, well, now it's not a philosophical problem, it's a theological mystery. Let's go switch realms or something like that.
Right.
Whereas the Swinburnian one is like, okay, we'll kind of be more modest. We won't say there's an absolute demonstration for God, but now we got we got a scale. We got theism, we got atheism. And maybe we'll just give the problem of evil to atheism. All right, weight goes down. But, says somebody like Swinburne, there's a whole lot more on the theistic side.
Right.
Contingency, fine-tuning, consciousness, rationality, whatever else you want to stack over there. So that way on our total understanding of things, it's still theism, right? So just to give kind of people an idea of the different ways that this can play out. But yeah, go ahead to add your comments on that.
No, that's good. And, well, Pat, one thing you mentioned there, it was something else that sort of drove my interest in classical theism, the problem of evil, and that's, you said something like, once you see that we can metaphysically demonstrate the existence of God, then it sort of becomes a theological mystery. And I think that's right. And one thing I kind of reflected on, or I've reflected on over the years, is that people 1,000 years ago, they were acquainted with suffering, probably much more so than we are. And yet they didn't see it as an epistemic defeater of their religious belief. They saw it as a mystery to be wrestled with, the way that Jacob wrestled with God.
And not only that, but as Stump points out, the real problem for at least earlier Christians wasn't the problem of why anything bad happens to people. Why does anything good happen to people?
Right, exactly.
It was the problem of the good.
Right, it was the problem of the good.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and so, and yet nowadays, in the modern world, when we arguably suffer less, at least physically, we do see evident evil as an epistemic defeater for God. And so why? And I think recovering this classical theistic picture of God sort of will help, I hope, with that problem.
Getting the right expectations back. I think that's right.
Exactly.
I think that's right. Yeah. There's been a lot of, I think, distortions and stuff that kind of sets up for that issue. More than we can probably untangle now, but it's a good point worth making. So yeah, please continue. I forgot where we left off. Yep.
So just classical theism supports natural theology. It also supports theodicy. It's interesting. Despite classical theists saying things like, we can't define God, or we don't know what God is in his essence, or our concepts apply to God only analogically, or the apophatic strain, which says all of our God talk is negative. Despite that, classical theists don't have a problem giving theodicies, trying to give explanations as to why God allows evil. That's probably in part because they are not just generic theists, but they're Christian theists or Jewish theists or Muslim theists, and so they're harnessing additional information made available to them through divine revelation, which allows us to start saying more theodicy wise than we could probably say on our own, just be a natural reason.
Right.
So in the paper, I cite Stump and sort of briefly summarize her Thomistic theodicy, and then I mentioned, classical theists been doing theodicy for a long time. Whether we're talking Anselm's wonderful little work on the fall of the devil, or Augustine's on the free choice of the will, or whoever. So clearly for classical theists in the tradition, theodicy and natural theology are fully compatible. So we can combine those two. And you do see sometimes people in the literature combining those two, like Swinburne. Swinburne will combine theodicy with natural theology. Obviously.
That's right. Yep.
And you do see people sometimes combining skeptical theism with reformed epistemology, like Michael Bergman, my dissertation supervisor, and planning.
Oh, you had Bergman as your? That's
yeah.
I read his Radical Skepticism book not too long ago. I thought it was pretty good.
Oh yeah, he's great. That's why I went to Purdue. Actually, it was a study with the one of Plantinga's students. Plantinga was sort of retiring at the time I was getting into.
Oh yeah,
graduate studies, and so I'm like, I got to find a Plantinga student then to. So classical theism, I think, also supports skeptical theism, and this might be a little surprising, but to some people. But I think there's at least three reasons that if you're a classical theist, you should also be a skeptical theist. First, there's this idea from Aquinas and others that we simply cannot know the divine essence. We can't define God. We can know that God is, Aquinas says, but we can't know what God is.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the apophatic strain of classical theism, and the apophaticism, the strength of it varies from one person to another. So it's really strong in Pseudo-Dionysius.
Mm-hmm.
It's not quite as strong in Aquinas, I would argue. It's not a pure apophaticist.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is, even for someone who's not a pure apophaticist, a lot of our God talk is still negative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Even if not all of it's negative, a lot of it's negative. So we're mostly saying only what God is not. We're not mostly saying what God is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then thirdly, our God talk is analogical. And again, there are different doctrines of analogy in the tradition. Some people would say, and I would be probably sympathetic to this, that all of our God talk is analogical. Some people want to say most of our God talk is analogical. But the point is that I would say most, if not all of our God talk is analogical. And so it's not univocal. So when we say God knows, it's true that God knows. Or we say that God loves, it's true that God loves, but we don't know exactly what that means.
Mm-hmm.
If I say Pat knows, his children's names, then I know exactly what that means. But when I say God knows, I don't know exactly what that means.
Mm-hmm.
And so these three limitations, we can't know the divine essence, apophaticism, and the doctrine of analogy, these are going to seriously impede our ability to say how God governs the world in any kind of detail.
Yeah.
God would or wouldn't do that. That's going to be very difficult for us to say, given these limitations on our knowledge of God, especially absent divine revelation. And so I think if you're a classical theist, you have pretty good reasons to affirm skeptical theism.
Right. Some brand of skeptical theism.
Some brand of it.
Right.
Exactly.
Because it comes in many flavors, right?
It does. It does.
Yeah.
And then the final member of the initial quartet is Reformed epistemology. And I think a classical theist can, I think they do, but for the most part, also embrace the idea that belief in God can be, to use Plantinga's terminology, properly basic.
Yeah.
And I talk about that in the paper, not a lot, but I talk about it in terms of Aquinas, recognizing that man has both a natural and planted knowledge of God, and that the knowledge of God available through philosophical reasoning is limited. It's mixed with error. It's available only to a few. This is the first article of Summa, right? This is why we need some science besides philosophy. So when you put those two things together, this idea of a natural and planted knowledge of God, and the difficulty of arriving at a true knowledge of God by philosophy, a good explanation for that pair of things that Aquinas says is that for Aquinas, belief in God can be properly basic.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think classical theism gives you good reasons to think that all four of these standard responses in the contemporary Anglophone analytic literature are all good responses. And then the question becomes, are they compatible? But before I discuss their compatibility, Pat, let me mention the kind of a unique contribution that classical theism provides, and that's through the privation theory of evil.
Yeah.
So one thing that I noticed in this class that I took in 2012 at Purdue is that in the Anglophone analytic literature, there's very little discussion of the nature of evil, metaphysically.
This is right. Yeah.
And the only people you can find discussing this tend to be classical theists.
Yeah, like David Oderberg. He's still out there cranking it out, right?
Yeah, exactly. But interestingly, Pat, their work is often not engaged with by the mainstream analytic Anglophone philosophers.
Right.
So as much as I love William Roland Paul Draper, they're not out there engaging David Oderberg. They're not engaging Brian Davis. They will engage Stump, but beyond that, they don't, and they typically don't discuss in their own work at all anything about the nature of evil metaphysically considered.
Yes,
which is an odd lacuna. We're talking about evil as a problem for theism, but what is evil?
Right. You would think, right? Because when we think about the problem of evil, we think, well, logical problem of evil, evidential problem of evil, and people, yes, there's people who argue that they don't find those distinctions helpful. But put that aside. Well, what about the metaphysical problem of evil? Right.
Yes. Right.
What is the nature of evil? And if it's something created, how can we say that God like puts some being into it, right? Isn't that an issue?
Right.
Yeah, you're right. It is a very an odd gap out there in the contemporary conversation, to be sure. Like again, you're right. There's a lot of classical theists out there who are doing, I think, tremendous work. Like Odeberg's Metaphysics of Good and Evil. I loved it. But there's also David Alexander's God, Goodness and Evil. I think the title of it was really great. So you're getting
Yep.
like great stuff on it, but it's just kind of in its own little
Yeah.
circle, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So, and I think, Pat, that's probably a function of two things. One is that contemporary philosophy is very ahistorical.
Mm-hmm.
And so although discussions of the nature of evil loom large in the tradition, when you do philosophy in a way that's disconnected from the tradition, that's going to lend itself to you sort of ignoring those discussions. And then secondly, I think sort of hyper specialization in philosophy, and so people they don't connect the metaphysical dots with the philosophy of religion problem, so to speak. But once you do start thinking about these things in connection with one another, you can see that the privation theory of evil for the classical theists. So the privation theory of evil is just the idea that the nature of evil is that it's a privation of a due good. It's the absence of some being that is supposed to be there. And so the existence of evil implies the existence of the way things are supposed to be, which is teleology.
Yeah.
So it's a privation in the way something is supposed to be, which implies that a thing has a nature which is directed at a certain mode of being, and that it lacks that being, and it's bad. And so evil seems to imply teleology. But teleology, a la Aquinas' fifth way, seems to imply the existence of God.
Right.
And Aquinas actually makes this point explicitly in the Summa Contra Gentiles, and I'll quote him here. Patty says, "Now with these considerations, we dispose of the error of those who, because they notice that evils occur in the world, said that there is no God. Thus, Boethius introduces a certain philosopher who asks, if God exists, whence comes evil? But it could be argued to the contrary. If evil exists, God exists. For there would be no evil if the order of God were taken away, since its privation is evil. But this order would not exist if there were no God."
Right.
And so evil actually, if anything, according to Aquinas, can be used to demonstrate the existence of God via this idea of teleology, teleological causality, implying the existence of God.
Yeah, I agree with that. So unless a skeptic wants to kind of like step off the plate and become kind of a nihilist, so it's kind of this funny thing. I think that's right. So you might press the problem of evil to become a naturalist, but I think once you're a naturalist and you lose the framework to make sense of teleology, you then just lost everything you need to run through the problem of evil, right? Like it's this kind of weird thing where it's like it's only a problem initially if you're already on the theistic plate, right? As soon as you step off the theistic plate, you kind of lose that, right? And I think that's right. I think that's the right way of actually kind of framing the moral argument. Is, to me, moral arguments just bleed into cosmological arguments, right? You think of finite natures like human nature. We're oriented towards some end, some state of actuality that we don't possess or currently have, right? And what does that reveal to us in our being? That we're composites, that we're metaphysical dependents, right? And an evil is when some due actuality doesn't occur, right? That is good for us along relevant features. The notion of relevant features is important for the privation theory, I think. And then you just run your causal argument to God from there, right? That to me is the moral argument, but at some sense, I think it becomes indistinguishable from the cosmological argument. It's just that the moral insight is just a way to kind of peer into the deeper metaphysics that's going on, and then you're just kind of into those first cause type of arguments,
morality is just the manifestation of final causality in a creature with free will and rationality.
Totally,
and so really the moral argument, properly thought of, is just an argument from final causality. I think
100%. Completely agree. Very well said.
And that's one of the four causes.
Yep.
And so in that sense, you're right. It does bleed into into a type of cosmological argument.
Yeah. So that's right. So like to make sense of our judgment of evil seems to presuppose certain things that can only really be secured on a like a theistic background, if you will, right?
Right.
So in that sense, the skeptic faces some sort of a dilemma: either abandon the problem of evil, and maybe they do have some other arguments against God. I'm sort of with you there, Dr. Fuqua. I don't think that there's. I mean, so if we're doing taxonomies, what are some of the other arguments against God?
Yeah, the other two.
Aquinas gives two, right? You don't need there's evil, and you don't
Yeah.
need God to explain things. Those are the two
Right.
big ones. And then I
Yep.
guess the third class in contemporary conversation would just be like coherence issues, right?
Yep.
Like omnipotence paradoxes and
Exactly.
stuff like that,
Right.
right?
Yep.
And I'm with you. I don't think that those are issues. Or if they're issues, they're not usually issues for the classical theist because of the apophatic approach. It kind of gives
Right.
an oppressive shield around a lot. Like we don't start with. So I'm kind of rambling here, but I sometimes get excited, right? We don't start with like forming an idea of omniscience at the abstract and then test that hypothesis, right? No, we get to a sort of restricted understanding of omnipotence through the effect to cause reasoning, right?
Right.
And same thing with omnipotence. But then, this is through that sort of apophatic process, and it's a very restricted understanding of these things. So, for example, for the classical theist, omnipotence is not just the ability to do anything. It actually concerns producibility, the ability to produce things, right? And that's a subtle but important difference that helps to evade a ton of paradoxes that are often lobbed at theists and omnipotence and stuff like that. Sorry, totally off topic, but yeah.
No, it's not off topic. And I think I think you're right. That's exactly how I think of it. Those are the three objections that we face. And I think often those who are pressing the argument in one way or another, that the concept of God is incoherent, I think they're often just as sort of metaphysically naive, if you will, as some other people who work in philosophy of religion, but seem to not notice the deep connections between metaphysical reasoning and philosophy of religion reasoning. Because, like you said, those problems just don't arise for the classical theist.
Yeah, agree. Well said. Okay, so all right, back to you now. Keep us moving along wherever we left off.
Okay, thanks. So classical theism, I think it gives us this holistic framework and gives us good metaphysical reasons to support 5 now total responses. And the only question is then, can we combine these things? And the main sticking point here would be skeptical theism. Because people have argued that skeptical theism basically implies that you can't reason about what God would or wouldn't do, and that undermines the thought is, again, people publish this, that undermines the project of natural theology and the project of theodicy. You can't say what God would do or wouldn't do, and you can't say that God is certain goods are likely to so that certain goods are such that God is likely to bring them about in the world. You can't say that if you're just in the dark about what God would or wouldn't do. And you can't also say that there are certain goods that require certain evils, the permission of certain evils, and God would likely allow those goods and therefore that allow those evils as well. You just can't. So you got to pick. You're either going to be. So this is how it's sort of how it is in the contemporary literature, right? You got to pick. If you want to be a Swinburnian type of guy, fine. You can combine natural theology with theodicy, or you can be more of a Plantinga guy, and you can combine Reformed epistemology, Plantinga, Bergman, etc. You can combine Reformed epistemology with skeptical theism.
But you can't be a totally greedy pig.
You can't. Yeah, you can't have it all. So, now it's interesting. So historically, I think you do find the greedy pigs, right? Classical theists.
Oh, I'm a greedy pig with everything, man.
So
universal causality, libertarian free will, absolutely.
Exactly.
All of these responses probably give it. Yeah, all of it.
And so not only do you find in the tradition major philosophers defending many of these responses in their work, but even in contemporary philosophy, I noticed that in Plantinga's work. So, as you probably know, Pat, he's got he defends the modal version of the ontological argument.
Yeah, that's right.
And then he's got this paper, 24 or so theistic arguments.
Yep. But good, a pretty good book came out of that too.
And a pretty good book came out,
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, and then he's got the free will defense, which he writes about in the 70s. And then in 2004, he publishes this supralapsarianism theodicy. And then he's obviously into Reformed epistemology. And and then he also seems to embrace skeptical theism.
Yeah.
It's got in this paper he writes on the book of Job.
Mm-hmm.
But Flanagan never explicitly conceived of combining these into a holistic response. Just like in the 70s he said this, in the 80s he said this, in the 90s he said this, in the 2000s he said this. And so if you read across the corpus of his work,
Right.
you can see all these four responses. And so I'm like, okay, implicitly he was kind of onto something there that was recognized in the tradition and then kind of forgotten, I think.
Yeah.
So there's skeptical theism, I think. First of all, it's not incompatible with natural theology, and easiest way to see that is to make a distinction, Pat, as you did, between the sort of Swinburnian style probabilistic natural theology that's very common today, and the project of metaphysical demonstration. So when you argue from the existence of changing beings to an unmoved mover, you're not predicting. That argument doesn't proceed on the basis of predicting that there's something that God would likely allow. We see that in the world, and therefore it's evidence for God. That's not how the argument goes at all.
That's right.
When you're arguing from, look, all the beings of our experience, in those beings, there's a distinction between essence and existence. But could everything that exists exhibit this distinction? No, because in every such being that exhibits this distinction, there's received existence. But of course, you couldn't have only received existence, because then there'd be no source of existence. So there must be something in whom there is no such distinction. So there must be something that's pure being itself. Again, you're not predicting that if God exists, then there's going to be this thing in the world. We see that thing, therefore it's likely that God exists.
Yeah. Searching out a necessary condition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it seems like skeptical theism is at least compatible with the sort of classical natural theology project of the great thinkers, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian in the tradition,
and pagans too. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So and Plato and Aristotle too, or Plotinus, exactly. So yeah, there's no incompatibility there if you just do natural theology in the right way.
Agreed. Right.
And then so the other sticking point is between skeptical. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that we've taken care of that alleged incompatibility. You still got one other sticking point to this fivefold holistic response, and that is skeptical theism compatible with theodicy? And so here, and this might be my only truly novel suggestion, Pat, in this paper, is I make a distinction between types of evil and tokens of evil.
That's right. That's right. And I was going to tell you, I myself was probably in the position, even in my own work, I've kind of just left skeptical theism aside. I've been the more, let's just do the theodicy and natural theology type of thing. But you've got me thinking about this in a new way. So yeah, please continue. Yep.
So this is not a distinction that's typically made explicitly in the literature at all.
Right.
And I remember I actually kind of stumbled onto this way of thinking about it back in 2012, and I asked Dr. Draper. I said, "Do you think?" Because I haven't seen this in print anywhere, a discussion of this. I said, "Do you think that if I have an explanation for a type of evil, that I have an explanation for every token of that type? Because if I do, then if the free will theodicy works, I've explained every instance of moral evil in the history of angelic and human existence, right?"
Right.
And he said, he's like, "Oh, that's a great question." He said, "No, I don't think you do. So I think you can have an explanation for some type without having an explanation for every token of that type." I was like, okay, that's interesting. So then, when I was at Purdue, we came to campus a couple times. I was able to have a conversation with him at one point, and I asked him in person. I said, "Dr. Flanagan, do you think?" I didn't tell him what Draper's answer was. I just said, "Do you think that having an explanation for a type of evil entails having an explanation for every token of that type?" He said, "Oh yeah, I think it does." That's interesting. And then Swinburne came to Purdue. We held a conference at Purdue in honor of Swinburne's retirement from Oxford in 2014. And so he came, and I was able to have a conversation with him in a small group. It wasn't me and Swinburne one-on-one, but I wanted to ask him the same exact question that I'd asked Dr. Draper and Alan Flanagan. So I did. And he said, "Yeah, if you've got an explanation for every type, then you've got an explanation for every token of that type." Now, if that's true, then it makes the
And by the way,
project.
for people who aren't familiar, I realize that the type token distinction is just the difference between the class of objects and the individual instances.
Yeah,
in the
exactly.
class.
Right.
Yeah.
So like redness and red things,
Right. Yeah.
or instances of redness.
Right.
So let's say this is an important distinction to make in the conversation. Then it seems like we can be skeptical theists about tokens of evil, and yet be theodicists about types of
About
evil.
types. Yeah.
So I can say that, given the value of rationality and free will, it's very likely that God would bring about creatures of a certain type, right? Rational creatures. But that does not imply that I can say that it's very likely that God would bring about Homo sapiens specifically, or that God would bring about you and me individually. I can't say that. And so likewise, maybe I can say that God would allow the type moral evil, but that doesn't mean. So I can say yes, very likely, given because we're a robust libertarian conception of free will, and that this is a very valuable thing. It's likely that God would allow the moral evil qua type. But that doesn't mean I have an explanation for every single token of that type. And so with respect to the theodicy that I'm attracted to, which is Stump's version of Aquinas' theodicy.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, she says that God allows evil on her understanding of Aquinas, so as because this is the best way for God to facilitate one of two things: either drawing us closer to Him, or preventing us from moving further away from Him.
Right. It's all about treating a spiritual cancer for stuff,
exactly.
and she draws a careful distinction between her and John Hick on that point.
Right. And so suffering is medicinal in this way. If it's salvific in this way, if it's sanctifying in this way, then I can say it's not. I can at least say this: it's not unlikely that God would allow medicinal suffering. But that doesn't mean for any token instance of evil, I can say exactly how likely that particular evil is, even given this theodicy.
Right.
So how likely is it that God would? How likely is it? Can I say that God would tell Abraham to sacrifice his one and only son Isaac and put him through that duress? I have no idea. I'm totally in the dark, right? So I think you can combine skeptical theism with theodicy by saying we can be skeptical theists about tokens of evil, but we can be theodicists about types of evil.
Yeah.
And I think that also has the side benefit, potentially, Pat, of actually kind of salvaging the compatibility of Swinburnian style natural theology with skeptical theism, because properly understood, what Swinburnian style natural theology is doing is predicting that God would allow certain goods of a certain type, not particular instances of those goods.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. So I want to see how you would position, if you would position it at all. Because, I like thinking about, I like this other thing. Are they compatible? So I like a lot about Stump's. But there are a few things I think that might kind of fall outside the scope of her general project. And she admits it, right? She admits it. And she also admits that her account, we shouldn't think that her account is like the only God justifying thing on the scene, right? She thinks that there might be other things at play. I think of von Ingwagen, right? And his considerations of arbitrariness and vagueness and stuff like that. So if people aren't familiar, let me see if I can remember his anecdote. Atlantis is sinking, and you're in charge of the boat, and you can take 1,000 people off, right? If you fill the boat all the way up, there's 100% chance that it sinks and everybody dies, right? You know that if just you go, there's 100% chance that you make it, right? Okay, all right. So what do we sort of know in this situation? Well, it's definitely wrong, not permissible to fill the boat all the way up. It's definitely wrong to leave everybody behind. It's wrong to only take a handful of people. It's wrong to only leave a handful of people. But somewhere you're going to have to draw a line. You're going to have to draw a line where it would have been the case that one more person or one less person really wouldn't have made a difference, right? This is the problem of arbitrariness that von Ingwagen is kind of getting at. And he wants to think or suggest that for all we know, this is exactly the case with God creating an arena or the conditions that are most conducive for these spell out whatever goods you want, right? And I guess the upshot of Van Inwagen's approach is that there might be a general reason, general policy of why there is no specific reason for this token, if you will.
Exactly.
So do you think that can be absorbed by your approach, and just your thoughts on all of that? You think that plays well with what you're going at there? Mm-hmm.
I think it can, Pat. And it's interesting. Van Inwagen does have a paper, and the title is something like "Particular Horrendous Evils" or something like that. So, I think, and I guess in the sense that there's no specific reason for that particular evil, you could say, well, no, that's gratuitous evil in some sense of gratuitous. And I think that's okay. I think there could be some tokens of evil, some instances that are gratuitous in that sense of gratuitous. That's compatible with having a theodicy for evils of that type.
But then you would just think there has to be something more to the story after that for that person.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's compatible with other tokens of that type not being gratuitous in any sense at all.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. So you certainly don't have to think, right? So just for people who aren't familiar, like Stump wants to say that if God permits suffering for an individual, it's only going to be the case if that is the best available means for this ultimate good, right? This treating of the spiritual cancer. And you might read Von Inwagen and think, well, maybe that's not the case. But I think what you just said is actually right? That there might be certain cases where there might not be a reason for this particular instance, but other cases where no, this definitely was for the benefit of that particular individual as well. So I've always been thinking that these accounts are actually complementary.
I think that's right. And one, I heard William Lane Craig say one time, maybe I read it somewhere, but he said the evils that trouble him, which is kind of an ironic thing to say, but it sort of made sense to me. He said it's not the big evils, it's the small ones. Like when I get up in the middle of the night to get a drink of water and I stub my toe. Is there some theodicy that explains why God allowed that particular instance of evil? And so, not that serious evils couldn't be gratuitous in Van Inwagen's sense. I think some of them probably are, but when you think of these minor evils, stubbing your toe and so forth, maybe a lot of those evils are gratuitous. And
where they're the result is sort of, the inevitable result of a general policy that God has, of course, a justifying reason to enact, and God can obviously intervene probably quite frequently without, making nonsense of that general policy. He can't do it all the time, however, right? So again, you're back to issues of arbitrariness. You're back to issues of arbitrariness. But I actually think it's a tremendously brilliant insight from Von Inwagen.
I agree.
And the truth is, we don't know how often God intervenes, right? Maybe he would have stubbed his toe twice that night, and God's like, enough. You're only going to do it once tonight, right? We just don't. This is something we're definitely in the dark about. I mean, we seem to have evidence where God has intervened, right? We seem to have good evidence around various what appear to be miraculous accounts of things, right? And I think that shouldn't be ignored, especially the ones that do seem to be well evidenced as well. But these issues of arbitrariness, I think, are really important, but I think they can kind of be maybe best understood under like the general policy type of theodicy.
It certainly makes the response to the problem of evil a little bit easier for us theists if we can argue that gratuitous evil is compatible with theism, because then we don't have to explain those evils.
Yeah. And by gratuitous, I would just want to qualify that it would be only gratuitous like in this life. We obviously, as classical theists who hold an afterlife, don't think it's ultimately like irredeemed or undefeated, right? We would of course say that it is ultimately defeated, right? And defeatable.
Right. The back to the type token thing for just 1 second.
Yeah,
Pat.
for sure.
Here I am, this PhD student, and I got planning on Swinburne on the one hand saying something very different from what Dr. Draper was saying. And so I kind of thought, well, maybe we can sort of put the atheologian in we can present the atheologian with a sort of dilemma. Either having an explanation for every type entails having an explanation for every token of that type, or it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
If it does, then if I've got some plausible theodicies, you're done.
Mm-hmm.
Like the problem of evil doesn't get off the ground. If it doesn't, then I'm going to combine skeptical theism and theodicy, and I'm going to give you theodicies for the types and skeptical theism about the tokens.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Either way, I'm good.
Mm-hmm.
My theistic belief is not defeated at the end of the day.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's really good. And the other thing, if we just want to spend a few more minutes here, this has been great. It's the ratio that matters, right? It's the ratio that matters in the worldview comparison. So even if you thought at the end of the day, yeah, maybe it's not like the most probable thing that we would have this distribution of suffering we do on theism, but you still have to ask, how probable is it on the alternatives?
Right.
How probable is it on the alternatives? And the more I have thought about this, Dr. Fuqua, I would not expect a world like this at all if naturalism were true. Right? There's so many barriers that you have to get over, that unless the naturalist hypothesis, and I take in a simplistic way, the theistic hypothesis is pure perfection, divine reality. Naturalism is pure indifference. It's a principle of indifference, right? What do you expect from indifference?
Right.
Nothing. Nothing. I expect literally nothing, right? Literally, there's not a single expectation I can generate from pure indifferent static.
Right.
And if I'm going to get to the point of all the conditions of place where evil could even possibly come on the scene, I will have had to have complicated that theory.
Right.
So damn much, right? Like a ridiculous amount to get to, and I think that's something that's so missed. And at that point, yeah, maybe we could get the expectations up if I've wired in so much complication to that root theory.
Right.
But if we're being consistent in our evaluation of worldviews, all that complication is now counting massively against that theory and its intrinsic likelihood. Right.
Right. Exactly. Now the prior probability of that complicated picture is so low that it's going to drag down the posterior probability of the whole of the worldview.
Right. Is that wrong? Am I wrong in all that? Or do you think that's all?
I think that's right. Yeah. And yeah, there's, like you said, there's nothing about the content of naturalism that would lead you to make a likelihood prediction that creatures of this type are going to exist with these natures and have these potencies for these actualities and things. Yeah, there's nothing in naturalism, the content of it, that makes that prediction likely to turn out true at all, I think.
Yeah, or even if you got there, that the distribution of suffering would be in the sort of range where saints actually do emerge, right? And this is Doherty's point. He's like, even if we just concede and just get to the suffering consideration, it seems like the dials could have been all over the place, right? Far worse, none at all, right? But it seems like we kind of fall in a range where, yeah, there's hard cases. Nobody's denying that.
Right.
But we don't see if there's anything beyond the end of this life or what the rest of the story is. But we do see incredible heroes emerge, incredible saints emerge in this distribution that we have. And that's the sort of thing that we think classical theism actually predicts. But naturalism makes no prediction for that type of range.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I definitely want to admit, like, look, if you are bothered by the problem, we're all bothered by it, right?
Right. Exactly.
We're all bothered by it. There's no doubt here. But in my more sober moments, Dr. Fuqua, when I really sit back and I think I'm thinking as clearly as I can on it, right? And my knees aren't aching too much or whatever. That just seems right to me, right? Everything that you said, it just seems right to me that not only is it not evidential weight against theism, but somehow almost amazingly and ironically, when I think in my best moments of thinking about it, it points me back for various reasons, considerations of teleology, the sort of arena that we're in, what I see emerge in this arena, and with an appropriate amount of humility, and I think a modest amount of skepticism, it points me back towards theism, not away from it. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's another instance of something that's really beautiful from a theological point of view, which is that no matter what feature of the finite order you look at, God's fingerprints are all over it.
Right.
And if you've got eyes to see, you can trace those fingerprints back to their divine origin.
Yeah, and to that I would say amen. So Dr. Fuqua, before we go, please, why don't you tease the book one more time? What else can people find in here? And then, sorry, I got to get on camera. And then any other projects you're working on and ways people can keep up with you wherever you're at on the internet or social media or website or anything?
Yeah, so like you said, Pat, this is the book, Classical Theism, New Essays on the Metaphysics. Brand new book, cutting edge volume of essays on the metaphysics of the divine nature according to classical theism. It's out by Routledge, stellar lineup. It's free on Kindle right now on Amazon Prime. I have another forthcoming edited volume, Pat, which will be out later this August. It's called The Cambridge Handbook of Religious Epistemology with John Greco and Tyler McNabb.
Yeah, so great. Really looking forward to that one.
And some other papers in the works. I don't have a fancy website. I'm always thinking this is something I should do, is to create one. But I do keep my academia.edu page fairly updated. So if people are interested in other things I've done, that's a good place to find that work.
Wonderful. Well, we will certainly be bugging you to come back on and talk about the epistemology volume when that's out, Dr. Fuqua.
Yeah, happy to do it.
I thank you for this wonderful, very helpful conversation. Again, just having these different taxonomies, I think, will be of great interest and help to people. So thank you so much. It has been a joy. And gentle listeners, please do share your thoughts afterwards. If you like what we're doing here, you can subscribe to the channel, like, comment, share it. We appreciate you, and we'll catch all of you guys next time. Fare thee well.